Hello and welcome to the Chills at Will podcast. This is episode 47, and it is a pleasure to be joined by Bradford Pearson. He is the former features editor of Southwest the magazine. Brad has written for the New York Times, Esquire, Time, and Salon, among many other publications. He grew up in Hyde Park, New York, so he's the most famous from Hyde Park and maybe Roosevelt's, I think, second, a close second, right? And he now lives, Brad does, in Philadelphia. The Eagles of Heart Mountain is his first book, and it was published January 5th of this year. The book has been reviewed very favorably in the Washington Post, who called the book, quote, an absolutely stirring story, unquote. Of the book, Publishers Weekly wrote, quote, Pearson succeeds in unearthing a feel-good story from a dark chapter in U.S. history. The result is a worthy portrait of triumph in the face of tragedy, end quote. Brad, thanks so much for joining me on this episode. It's an honor to have you on. How did I do on the intros? Anything else you'd like to add?
No, that's good. That's a pretty good synopsis. That's the kind of stuff that my mom says. So I think that you hit the high
Okay,
notes. Yeah,
nice. I know that there's when I say among many other publications, that's something we can talk about. I know it's an extensive list. Let's start off by shouting out the book.
sure.
Congratulations, first of all. What is a heck of a book. What a great addition to the sports landscape, to the history landscape. Who was it published by? Where can we get it? All that good stuff.
Yeah, like you said, the book came out January 5th. Simon & Schuster's Atria imprint put it out. So you can get it wherever you get your books. So local bookstores, bookshop.org. Two places that I like to shout out specifically are the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center, which is the museum at the site of the former Heart Mountain camp,
Okay.
and the Japanese American National Museum, which also sells it, and whose site and archives were super helpful in the completion of the book. And I did some interviewing there too.
Well, that's great. The National Museum you referred to, is that the one in LA?
Yep. Yeah. Right in Little
Okay.
Tokyo in Los Angeles.
All
Yeah.
right,
And
great.
then the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center is in outside of Cody, Wyoming. So
Okay.
if you're planning a trip to Yellowstone
Yeah.
anytime, you got your vaccine, you're all good to go.
Right.
Stop in at the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center too. It'll be a great experience and probably, like it did for me, completely change the track of your life.
Right. Wow. Appreciate that safety first as well. Once you're vaccinated,
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
appreciate that. Safety first. Safety first. Let's talk a little bit about growing up in kind of like your literary life. Like I said, Hyde Park, which I guess is kind of suburban New York City. Is that a good
Mhm.
way to describe it? Okay. So,
Yeah, it's like the end of the commuter train. The last Metro North stop is Poughkeepsie. That's the next town over. So
okay.
it's like the furthest you would probably live outside of New York City and still possibly work in the city.
That makes sense. All right. So I'm wondering about, what kind of, was it a print rich environment at home? What were you reading? What were you writing? And then on to, who were some of those authors and books and other texts that really inspired you as a kid?
I was not a great reader or
Okay.
writer as a kid. As a little kid, I loved reading and writing. But then by the time I got to high school, I feel like I was a fine student. I got into college and did fine or whatever on AP classes, but it was just not something that I really loved to do
Hmm.
until my junior year of high school. I took this AP class that was sort of a collaboration between the US History Advanced Placement course and the English course. So
Nice.
we had two teachers, and one of them taught US history and one of them taught the English stuff, but they taught in conjunction
Hmm.
so that all the literature lined up with the history that we were learning too. And at that time, we read Moby Dick, and Moby Dick, going from someone who barely did the reading to having Moby Dick dropped on your desk probably doesn't seem like the most natural progression for most bibliophiles. But
Sure.
for me, having that book and starting to read it, I realized that I didn't realize that you could do that with a book. I didn't realize that you could sort of create this narrative and then hang all these other sort of interesting chapters on it about whaling or knots. And it was one of the first books that I read that I thought was really funny.
Okay.
And the Eagles of Heart Mountain isn't a very funny book, but some of the other stuff that I write, I try to even, stories I've written about my own life that are pretty dark. I've tried to use some humor in. So Moby Dick for me in high school was it sounds kind of pompous to say, but I went from basically not reading anything to reading something like Moby Dick and realizing that, oh, hey, there's something here.
Mm-hmm.
There's something that I find interesting and engaging in a place that I didn't necessarily find it before. And then after that, I had the same teacher my senior year of high school, and I'm not really sure how he got away with some of this, but he let us, we read like Clockwork Orange and Sir
Ooh.
Gawain and the Green Knight and um, Beowulf and a bunch of British stuff that was really kind of off the beaten path for like a public
Uh-huh.
high school in New York. So I think that kind of opened my eyes to what reading and writing could really do aside from, I didn't really have, I don't know. I loved playing sports in high school. So it
Mm-hmm.
was like
Mm-hmm.
taking the other classes was, going to high school was fine from an academic standpoint. But there's one teacher, Mr. Briggs, I actually thank him in the acknowledgments of
Mm-hmm.
Eagles because he sort of opened my eyes to a whole different world and made me think about reading and writing a lot differently.
Wow. Shout out to Mr. Briggs, definitely.
Yeah, Bren
Oh man.
Briggs.
Does he have a copy of the book?
I don't know. He actually runs a small bookstore in a town, like a used bookstore in Maine.
Okay.
And I should send him a copy.
That's awesome.
Um,
Yeah.
we're Facebook friends. So,
There you go. How long approximately is Moby Dick?
let's see. It's right here.
There it
I have it
is.
right behind me. It is, let's see. There's some sort of BS in the background with some reviews, but it looks like it's a little over 500 pages, at
Okay.
least this version.
Okay. Yeah, that's going from 0 to 60 pretty quickly, huh?
Yeah, yeah, and it was like I still think at that point in high school, it's probably the only book I'd ever read start to finish. Like
Mm-hmm.
I just was, it was, I don't know, it's probably not the right thing to say, but I wasn't a particularly motivated high school student.
Well, that's good to hear. And for my students, I teach high school English and Spanish. It's like it's never too late, right?
Yeah, no, it's true. Yeah, and it's one of those things where it's like, and it took me a long time after that even to really to come
Mm.
to journalism.
Okay.
Like I went to college and studied international relations, but I really went to college because I was recruited for the rowing team. So it's
Mm-hmm.
and then I got injured, so I had to find something to do with my time, and that's why I started working for the college newspaper. So that was
Okay.
kind of, I found writing. I found reading a little bit before writing, but then I found writing, especially as a career path, later than most people do. I think I probably
Mm.
wasn't until 20 or so that I thought of it as something that I might be interested in. And then, after college, up, it became my career, but
Yeah.
it definitely wasn't what I thought it was going to be when I first got to college.
Right. Well, George, who goes by Horse, Yoshinaga, who's one of the main characters of the book that we'll talk about a little bit later, he came to journalism kind of late in the game too,
Yeah, well, he
right?
was, he after he graduated high school, George was just looking for any job,
Mm-hmm.
and he sort of realized that he knew football because he played on the high school football team there, the Eagles,
Mm-hmm.
and walked into the Heart Mountain Sentinel newspaper and said, "I think I'd like to work for you." And then the editor at the time sort of asked him point blank, like bluntly, just the definitions of a few words, and he didn't know them. So he's like, "Okay, you should leave, learn what these things mean, and then maybe come back and we'll see if we have a spot for you here on staff."
Right.
So he sort of shoehorned his way into a career in journalism by becoming the beat writer for the team that he was on the previous season.
Uh-huh.
So I think the ethical gymnastics there might not be, are probably frowned upon in today's journalistic environment. But then I think the journalism ethics rules were a little bit different
Mm.
at an American concentration camp in
Sure.
1944 than than a
Sure.
newsroom in 2021.
I think that was the terminology used in the book, ethical gymnastics. That's some good stuff. That's some really good stuff. So yeah, I guess I misspoke. He didn't necessarily come to it late, but he came to it very much accidentally, right? Like you
Correct.
said, just kind
Yeah.
of like, oh, I need something to do, and it wasn't like it was a
Yeah.
burning
And then it
passion
became,
thing,
yeah, no, then it became his entire life. And, he
right?
was a newspaper columnist for literally the next 70 years.
Mm-hmm. I think in the book you were saying in the acknowledgments you hadn't played football. So what were your sports? You did rowing? What else did you do like
Yeah.
in?
Rowing was my big sport. I went to, like I said, I went to FDR high school, which is the
Mhm.
public high school, but they'd had a rowing team since the late 40s. And we were just,
Whoa.
just happened to be one of the public schools in New York that had a team there for a really long time. So I rowed all through high school, and I played soccer, and then I was on the winter track team. So
Okay.
sort of just things that required levels of endurance, but very little
Yeah.
hand-eye coordination.
Yeah, high school wrestling and rowing is so underrated, and they just seem like the practices are just brutal. You know?
Yeah. High school rowing, like it's college rowing is even tougher because you see everybody else is staying out until 2:30 in the
Yes,
morning,
I
and
remember
sometimes
that.
you're staying out until 2:30 in the morning, and then you still have to get up and be at practice at 5:30 before class starts at 8 or whatever. So it takes, once you go from high school rowing to college rowing, it's a different kind of endurance in terms of the
Yeah,
social aspects of those two different schools.
no doubt. I remember the rowers would leave a little earlier from the parties than the other people
Yeah.
would. Oh man. So maybe let's connect the dots a little bit to from those high school days to journalism to to writing such a great book and being published in New York Times, Esquire, etc. Where was that something that what kind of made you decide or made you think like, dang, I can do this. People like my stuff. I'm really good at this.
Oh, I guess I should probably still, I think about that still, like why people like why I got this opportunity. But I don't know. I mean, I'd had an agent for a few years before the Eagle story
Hmm.
came to me, or before I actually knew the Eagle story before I got an agent, but it was something that I hadn't worked on or hadn't thought about. But I don't know. It's one of those things where I think, I worked in I worked in community newspapers for a really long time, both in Maryland, New York, and then in Texas. And then I sort of made the jump to city magazines because I worked at D Magazine, which is the city magazine of Dallas. And then when I went over to Southwest, that's when I really started doing more feature work, from an editing and from a writing standpoint. So I think then is when I really, at Southwest, is when I really started getting confident in my writing, getting confident in my editing, and sort of really understanding like how a story works, why certain stories work and others don't, and what stories require length and what stories could be 1,500 words, what stories
Sure.
could be 5,000 words, and what stories should be a book.
Uh-huh.
And when I first started working on the Eagles, I had no idea what it was going to be. Like I sort of, I guess I can back up a little bit and say that the way I found the Eagles of Heart Mountain story was that I was on a freelance assignment for Cowboys and Indians magazine, which is this magazine based in Dallas that's sort of a magazine of the American West.
Mm.
And they'd sent me to Yellowstone to basically be in Yellowstone for a week and write about Yellowstone, which was a great assignment for like a 28-year-old that was just like, oh, I got to go to a place I've never been before and hang out for a week.
Sure.
But then one day, someone who was working the press tour said, oh, we're going to also go stop by this museum, this at the former Heart Mountain site. It's called the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center. And that was where I first encountered the story of the Eagles. It was a very small mention on one of the museum displays. And, I went home and I wrote the story about Yellowstone, and I just couldn't stop thinking about this one little fragment of a story about this Heart Mountain camp. And it would sort of disappear from my brain for months or a year, and then it would come back, and I'd sort of think like, oh, I should do a little more research into that. And then I really just started sinking my teeth into it and started trying to work on it in 2017. So 2018, 4 or 5 years later.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of when everything kind of snowballed and then became the book.
Sure. I wonder, and this, this could be present day, this could be past. I wonder who some of those writers were who either, I guess, either or and or inspired your style of writing, or just that you just love to read. Maybe you wouldn't say that your style is like them, but who gave the chills at will that goes
Yeah.
with the podcast title.
Yeah. I think there's certainly some writers that I love, and people that I think if I look back on it, I would say like, oh, okay, like my style is like them. I don't know if it's necessarily because of like, I like the way that Dennis Johnson writes like really short
Mm.
sentences, and
Hmm.
Cormac McCarthy writes really short sentences, and they do this in this sort of declarative way. And I never really thought about my style as being related to theirs. And obviously, I think that those are two people well beyond my league. But there's certain times where you read that, and I like their pacing.
Mm, okay.
Um, and then there's other writers that I can't write anything like, or can never reach. Somebody like Valeria Luiselli,
Mm.
who I've read like all of her books, and her books are incredible, and they're incredible and have this incredible rhythm to them and an incredible emotion, despite the fact that I'm reading them in English. So most of her books are originally written in Spanish,
Yeah.
which sort of shout out to translators everywhere for figuring out how to capture the nuance of that. I guess from a magazine standpoint, I mean, it's probably a trite answer at this point, but like Patrick Radden Keefe is just not only from a style and the standpoint, but like the man just knows how to write like so many different kinds of stories that is, I always just find incredibly daunting. And then I was actually lucky enough that Patrick agreed to do one of my book events with me earlier this year.
Cool.
And him and I were talking beforehand. Yeah, it was great.
Mm-hmm.
Him and I were talking beforehand, and we both sort of landed on one of his colleagues, Nick Baumgarten, and both of us just love all of his writing. Like he has this really economic style of writing where he just sort of is able to really pack a lot of description into a very few words within a sentence. It's not necessarily, his stories aren't short. They just like each sentence sort of carries an economy to it that I really appreciate. Yeah, those are right now I'm reading a lot of Brian Washington's stories.
Okay.
His books are awesome, and they're so conversational in a way that my writing is not. That I love how he's like having a conversation with the reader, and he's I don't know, his books also make me really hungry because he writes about food. He writes about food in a way that I think is enviable as a novelist or as a journalist. But I would think that most food critics and would even look at Brian Washington's writing and think like, I wish I could write about food like this guy. So those are my people right now in terms of sort of off the top of my head.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Something Lot is the name of his most recent book.
Yeah.
Is it just
Yeah,
called
Brian,
Lot?
it's called Lot. That's his short story collection. And then last year he put out Memorial, which is a full-length novel.
Okay. My next episode to be published later this week is Rowena Galovitz is a translator, and she actually talked a lot about Valerie Luiselli.
Oh man, yeah.
I don't know if she
It's
actually
just,
translated that one, but she,
yeah,
sure is great.
yeah. She just she I don't know. She kind of balances the reality that we all live in with like little bits of magical realism. So it kind of hurts your head. Like you don't really understand. Like there's times as a reader, I don't understand like if I'm missing what she's trying to do or if I understand it completely. And it like that kind of like tension when I'm reading, I really love. And her most recent book, which is called Lost Children Archives, actually inspired part of the style that if you read Eagles, there's a few instances where I sort of drop, not necessarily documents, but like a telegram or a game ticket into the text and actually use the imagery itself to sort of describe it. And she does that in Lost Children Archive. And when I read that, I was like, oh, I bet you I could borrow that idea and use it a few times throughout the book. So that was, I don't think our styles are anything alike, but I did sort of crib one thing from her books. Yeah.
Oh, that's really cool. So would that be like some of the areas that are italicized?
Yeah, either that or that when Simon Schuster was putting all the pages together, there's a telegram that comes in later in the book that comes from a trial result.
Right.
And that I sent them the original telegram. I was like, hey, could you try to recreate this in the book?
Okay.
So they did that. And then I also had like one of the first game the Eagles ever played. I found in the archives what the game ticket actually looked like. So I sent that to them to try to recreate so the reader could really see like the documents that were coming through, but they could still read it like it was just plain text. So
now you pulled that off very well. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. Did you see The Last Dance about the Chicago Bulls?
I did. Yeah.
Okay. People were kind of half joking, half serious, saying that they thought the new genre or the new like interview style was going to be that thing where they give like
they give
the iPad, right, and kind of see how he reacted. So I was kind of reminded of that when you're talking about the kind of within the story, you know what I mean?
And I thought that was an interesting choice by the director too, where he's just like, let's catch this emotion. It's so much easier and it's a better emotional response when you like have someone looking or reading something as opposed to you just recounting it to them.
Yes. Yeah, I thought that was kind of cool. We'll see if it catches on, So I wonder, being so having to be so technical in your writing particularly, for this book and using historical facts and archives and such. I wondered, like, does that affect the way you read other things? I mean, you've talked about that a bit, but it's like the comparison I would make is that as a former basketball coach and player, I would watch basketball differently.
Sure.
I'd be like, oh man, that backdoor cut, this and that,
Right.
rather than like, oh, that was so cool. Like, he did that because he faked, does that kind of affect the way you read and maybe more pleasure or less pleasure when you read?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I know for a fact that when I was writing the book, I couldn't read any nonfiction that wasn't book related because I would psych myself out, or I would like see how a certain author was doing something
Mm-hmm.
and I would say like, oh, I should try to do that. Or I would watch and sort of see how someone, a way that they sort of found something within their own reporting that I thought like, oh, I wonder if there's some sort of detail that's similar in my reporting that if I, just spend a whole day digging through this one thing, I'll be able to find. So I had to sort of cut out nonfiction reading
Okay.
that wasn't for the book for the time I was doing the physical writing of the book. But now when I read books, I always sort of looking for, I guess maybe it's kind of like a vulture mentality where I like look at a book and I'm reading it and I'm enjoying it. Then there's also one little thing that's maybe sort of a throwaway line or a small historical detail. And I say like, oh, that's kind of interesting. Like, I wish I knew more about that. And then I
Mm-hmm.
go to the footnotes and I see where that is. And I see the original document. And I sort of say like, because I've written one book now. So I sort of have to think like, oh, should I write another book? Do I want to write another book? So I sort of always looking within other stories I'm reading for little bits of things that maybe someone
Sure.
didn't pick at. And
Okay.
it's another way to it's another way to sort of hunt down stories too.
Right.
um but I will say that I since I've started writing the book, I've really expanded a lot more in how much fiction I read, because I think that I'm always sort of in awe of fiction writers, and I know it's something that I don't necessarily have the skill set for because they're creating these worlds whole cloth. No matter how much research they do for their book, they're still sort of creating these characters and their emotions that I don't have. My brain just doesn't work that way.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I like reading it because it sort of shows what drives people, and what drives readers, and what are the storylines and characters that resonate with people, and how
Sure.
can I reflect that in the nonfiction that I'm writing? So,
Mm-hmm.
what are sort of these emotions, or what are these small little anecdotes that I can use to illustrate this person's character? And especially writing a book where most of the main characters are dead, how do I sort of use these small stories and anecdotes that I know from their families and from interviews, in a way that sort of feels fictional, but I know and the reader knows isn't.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I'm thinking you've probably gone down some Wikipedia rabbit holes, huh? With those
Oh
footnotes
my
and stuff.
God.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah, there's so many times where it's like you just look up and you have 30 tabs open and you just say like, okay, well now I have to start reading these.
Right.
And there's so many times where you just end up in some other archival wormhole where,
Mm.
and we'll get to this about Eagles, but there was so much the Eagles archival stuff that I had to dig through from the National Archives was just after the war. A lot of times they created files of some stuff at the National Archives, but a lot of stuff they just sort of lumped all together into like a 1,000-page pile and then
Mm.
digitized it. So there were times where I would just be sitting there looking at a 1,000-page document on the National Archives website, and 997 of the pages had nothing that
Ah.
of value to them. But then like there would be like one where I'd be like, oh, that's an interesting detail. That's
Uh-huh.
an interesting thing that I could use in this way. And then you
Yeah.
just go to then you screenshot that and save it and put your notes down, and then you go to the next one.
Sure.
So it's like, picking through all of those. And anybody that's worked in archives knows that, you could spend a whole day looking for something and have a great day where every file you pull has something good in it. And there's times where you sit there and you've done something for 6 or 8 hours and you walk
Mm.
out with, a paragraph's worth of material.
Ouch. Um, you know, you obviously wrote the more historical, more research-based one. One of the pieces that you wrote before that was called "What Happened After My Kidnapping," which is pretty self-explanatory in some ways. I wonder about the decision to write that story. I mean, you went through such a traumatic incident. Was it? was it something that in the end was like cathartic, or was it like, I'm just really interested in the decision
Yeah.
to write about that.
Yeah, that was a thing that kind of like the Eagles in like a totally different way, just sort of
Mm,
like nagging me, and was something that um so for people who haven't read it, it's the headline sums it all up. It's what happened after my kidnapping. So my senior year in college, I went to school in Philadelphia, where I now live, and I got kidnapped. That's it's sort of a blunt way of putting it, but I was walking off campus. Three guys came up to me with a gun, threw me in the back of the car, drove me around, mock executed me, and left me in an abandoned lot. And took all my money, and it ended up that they had done it to lots of a bunch of other people around the city, and I was one of the later victims, and one of the first times that the first person that they had actually a real gun when they were doing the
mm,
kidnapping. Anyway, so eventually the three kids, they're all teenagers. The three guys got caught and sent to prison here in the state of Pennsylvania. And I sort of went about my life, and they went about their lives in a much different way than I did. But part of the settlement was that, or part of their case was that I received small amounts of restitution every quarter or every month. I don't remember, but I never cashed any of the checks. I was just like, it was kind of, for me, it was like, it wasn't, it was kind of like a petty thing. I was
mm,
just like, I don't need your money. Like, I've moved on, but I would still get these checks all the time. And it'd still be this reminder of this thing that had happened to me.
mm,
And the night I got kidnapped, I got home after I was kidnapped sometime like in the really early morning. I just started this is like right after I was maybe a year into working at the school newspaper and thinking like, oh, I like journalism. This is interesting. So I got home and I immediately wrote down all of everything I could possibly remember from what had happened the
mm,
previous 10 hours. And then I sort of turned that into an essay for my senior year literary journalism seminar. And then I turned it into an essay for like a writing conference years later. But I knew somewhere deep down that like, that wasn't an interesting enough story. Like, this
mm,
traumatic experience happened. And yes, that was trauma. There was trauma there. But I had processed the trauma of it actually um, fairly cleanly from a psychological standpoint, and that years later, it didn't really bother me. But I knew that if I actually wanted to explore it in a way that readers would be engaged and interested in, I thought that I should go talk to the guys that kidnapped me. So I started working on that and started reaching out to them in prison. And two of them had agreed to talk to me. So then, and they, luckily for me, they were both in the same prison in Northeast Pennsylvania. At the time I was in Texas. So I flew up and spent some days with them in the prison.
wow.
And sort of, yeah, I mean, my thinking on it was that I think at the time I was probably the only person in my life that thought it was a good idea.
Mm,
Um, my wife didn't necessarily like the idea. My mom really hated the idea. Uh, but then everybody was sort of like, this is what Brad needs to do, and this is what Brad needs to do. Um, and I guess there was a sort of a catharsis to it, but it was also something where it was like, from a journalist standpoint, I wanted to sort of explore, at the time that I got kidnapped, I was 21, and the people that kidnapped me were 19, 18, and 16. So we weren't really that different in age. So I wanted to sort of explore what our lives had each been like for the years after we
mm,
had met that one night in the kidnapping,
right.
and sort of see how their lives had been put on hold while they were in prison, and what my life had, it was fairly obvious in the story that my life had become that I was a journalist. So um, for me, it was, I don't know, I really liked writing that story, and it helped me as a writer learn that, you have to report a lot. You can't just rely on your own emotions. And, because I would never consider myself an essay writer. I like reporting a lot more than I like
Mm,
writing. So I think that was one of those things where it's just like having to report and report and report from prison, and from like a prison phone, and in letters to them. That was how I think I drove that story forward.
yeah.
It's a really long, rambling answer.
Well, no, I mean, thank you for sharing. Obviously, I'm sorry for such a traumatic event.
Oh, thanks.
Appreciate you sharing that. The Eagles of Heart Mountain. The full title is The Eagles of Heart Mountain,
Yeah, let's talk about something less depressing. That's
I don't know how
kidnapping.
good my transition was there. A, a true story of football, incarceration, and resistance in World War II America. Um, you talked about the background already. Was that trip to Yellowstone, and you kind of saw what you thought was maybe a little footnote and went with it. Um, you mainly focus on two characters, I would say, right? That's Babe, Nomura, and George, whose nickname was Horse Yoshinaga. But it sounds like talking to Kichi. I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing correct.
Kichi. Yep.
Kichi Ikeda.
Yeah.
And it sounds like an interview with him kind of set the book in motion. Am I getting the timeline correct?
The timeline, that's not necessarily true, but it definitely set it in like a different direction.
Okay.
So Kichi was the one living player that I was able to speak with on the Eagles. So like his having a conversation with him helped sort of ground the story and helped to ground the book from my own standpoint and say, like, okay, you are writing this book for this man and this man who lived this story. But it also sort of helped in that Kichi, in our interview, he talked a lot about how important sports were in the Japanese and Japanese American community pre-war, and things that he had done with his dad in terms of when the 1932 Olympics came to Los Angeles and what it meant for him to be a young Japanese American and watch the Japanese national swim team practice with his dad, who was a Japanese immigrant. So that sort of helped me sort of ground like how important sports were in this community, not necessarily just as Japanese Americans, but as their first generation, as their parents watched these Japanese athletes come over and really dominate the Olympic swimming, which was something that, up until that point, no one thought that an Asian team could do. So that helped me sort of think about sports a lot differently than I had before our interview.
Okay. So there was an email. I mean, I know it's hard to trace the beginning. There's always more of a beginning, but there was an email to the daughter of, was it George's daughter or Babe's daughter?
Babe.
Okay. And
Yeah.
that,
So that was, yeah. So after I sort of had this idea and then I wasn't doing anything with it. And I started worked at D and then I was working at Southwest and I was like, but I just couldn't get this idea in my head. So I was like, all right, well, let me start kind of pulling at some strings here. So I reached out to the people at the Heart Mountain Interpretive Center and I told them what I was interested in doing. And they're like, all right, we'll get in touch with this one guy. He'll send you every copy of the Heart Mountain Sentinel, which was a weekly newspaper that was at the camp. And I was like, oh, that'd be great. So this guy, his name is Bacon Sakatani, and he sent me this CD that had every issue of the Heart Mountain Sentinel newspaper and every issue of the Heart Mountain High School newspaper. So I just started reading those, and basically I found all this really robust sports section for a weekly newspaper, and they had all these different game highlights and columns and box scores and previews of next week's game and sort of post-ops of the last week's game. So I was reading through all those, and then when I was able to create this hierarchy is the wrong word, but I wanted to find out who the best players were if I was going to write this story, how I was going to hang this, who I was going to hang the story on, who the characters were. And that's when I found that basically, especially in that first season, it was people like Babe Nomura, George Yoshinaga, and Kichi Ikeda. So other than Kichi, both Babe and Horse are dead. So, reporters know that if you see that someone's dead, the first thing you do is you go to their obituary and scroll all the way to the bottom and you see who their surviving family members are. And then you just start trying to reach out to them. And luckily for me, I was able to find Babe's daughter. Her name's Jan Mori. And I was able to find her email address on some old LinkedIn page that she had. And I just sent her an email and said, you don't know who I am. I don't really know who you are, but I have come across all this information about your father that I'm sure you know some of it, but I'm sort of interested in who he was, not only as a football player, but as a person. Can we hop on the phone? And she somehow, she agreed. Luckily for me, it wasn't until a couple of weeks ago that Jan told me that before she agreed, she actually Googled every single thing and read everything I've written that she could find online, and then actually called Southwest Airlines to verify that I was who I said I was as the features editor of their magazine. So she did her research too. And then I talked to Jan, and she was great. And she was like, okay, I think that I was the first person to really sort of tell her dad's story on a bigger scale
Mhm.
especially outside of the Japanese American community.
Mhm.
And then that really, she vouched for me with Horse's Kids. She vouched for me with Kichi,
Mhm.
and then those sort of creating that group in the middle. Then I started reaching out to everyone at Heart Mountain, and the Heart Mountain community is really tight knit. And every year they actually have a pilgrimage
Mm.
out to the former campsite every July. So I started attending that and meeting more sources and meeting
Oh,
more
wow.
folks there, to not only to interview for the book, but to sort of, I would go to all the panels, I would meet with everybody, I would stay up all night with everyone, and sort of just sort of understand what this community was like, and sort of understand the stakes of what I was doing, and sort of understand and say, hey, personally, like, if you're really going to do this, like, this is the community that you need to honor and respect with your work here. So if you really think that, speaking to myself, like, if you really think that this is a book, that you can't half-ass this, like, you need to, like, do
Yeah.
this and, like, really do it.
Mhm.
Because these are the people whose story you're telling. It's not your story. So that was I still kind of get nervous thinking about it, uh, because I'm sure, I tried to work really hard to write a book that honored them, honored the players, and honored the team, honored the Heart Mountain community, and honored the Japanese American community
Mhm.
widely. But I'm sure there's still some folks that will pick it up and say that I didn't do that. So every day I still think about that.
Yeah. Yeah, I was gonna ask you about that responsibility of telling the story. But what positive feedback have you gotten from maybe from descendants, etc.?
It's really been great.
Mhm.
It's been sort of overwhelming and surprising that, all the family members that have read it and have reached out to me have,
Mm.
reached out positively and said that I captured their dad or their brother or their
Oh,
uncle,
wow.
or their husband really well.
Mhm.
Actually, just yesterday I got an email from, there's, for those who haven't read the book, there's sort of a second plot line about this, a draft resistance movement at the camp, and the leader of that was a man by the name of Frank Amy. And and he's been, dead for a few decades now, but I got an email from his daughter last night too that
Mm.
talked about how, she's like, when I first read the book, I had assumed that you had talked to my dad, but then I did the math and I realized that you couldn't have possibly talked to
Mm.
him. But it really seems like you did, in how well you wrote about him and got his personality and everything. So that sort of made my heart soar for a minute. And, um, but yeah, the families have been great. And then the Heart Mountain community has been super supportive, and the broader Japanese American community, in terms of Japanese American, newspapers and community groups and citizen organizations reaching out and, having events with me. And it's been, the support from the Japanese American community has really been overwhelming, not only in places like Los Angeles and Seattle and San Francisco, where they have large populations, but smaller populations in Philly and
Mm.
Denver and Chicago have really supported the book well, not just personally, but they've also, bought a lot of copies of the book. So it's
That's
great.
great. Oh, that's great.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, to be able to put a personal face to history, I mean, you can argue, and I'm not an expert, you can argue that more needs to be taught about, what happened during these times, or taught differently, but to know the individual stories, like you said, to know the before and the after, to know how much of a stud Babe was on the football field before the camps, and to know about Terminal Island, former San Pedro, Long Beach area, and how that community was just upended, to know about Mountain View, where George grew up, and even back to Hawaii and all that. Just the idea of putting the face on history is just, not is just something that's so valuable.
Ah, yeah, I really appreciate that. That was
But
something that I had this idea to write this book about this group of high school football players, but then pretty early on, I realized that it would be a more effective and a better book if I used this team to tell this story that
Mhm.
a lot of had been really, frankly, passed over in most textbooks. When you learn about Asian American history and U.S. history in high school, you basically learn about the camps for about maybe half a day or a
Sure.
day, and
Hmm.
you learn about the Chinese Exclusion Act. And that's pretty much all you learn about Asian American history
Yes.
in your average US American history class.
Hmm.
So I wanted to use this book as a way to sort of, as a little bit of a correction, but then also as a text that people could use if I did it properly and did it well, that made it the story a more accessible story for people, and sort of said, here's this dark part of American history that we should not forget. And here's also a kick-ass football team that will, help people read the rest of the book, and
Right,
get
right,
through,
right.
like you said, because I wrote a lot of history in this book too. So like you have to get through a decent amount of history to get to the games. So I asked the reader to do, and people have mentioned this a little bit in some of the reviews, but I do ask the reader to hold on with me for a little bit to get to like the fun, uplifting stuff.
Sure.
But I thought it was really important to set the tone and to set the context of what these players were dealing with and what their parents, the first generation, had dealt with for years, even before the camps.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I think you would probably argue that it was completely necessary that you did lay that groundwork in. And like you said, you do have to wait a bit to get to the games, but you start off the book with the families, with George's family, with Babe's. And then, yeah, I mean, I would consider myself to be fairly well versed in the ugly history, but I had no idea about,
Yeah.
the buildup, the cities, the big cities, the small cities, San Francisco, which is considered to be such a liberal city now, with
Yeah.
the exclusion acts, both in law and not, no doubt
Yeah.
about
And
it.
you think about, I mean, even, the city of Los Angeles right before, basically the city and the mayor and everybody turned against the Japanese American community. So we think about these, we think about California now as, sort of this liberal bastion, but
Right.
it's, it definitely, I think people still thought of themselves as good Democrats then, even despite the fact they were doing. I mean, FDR was the person that, signed off on all this. So, but you're right, like on the ground in San Francisco or LA County, the San Joaquin Valley, like all these different places that the people were just terrible, the Japanese
Yeah.
Americans.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's
No,
to put it bluntly. Yeah.
right. Right.
Yeah.
Um, I totally forgot my question. Oof, I'm getting old, I think. I'm getting old. Yeah, so I mean, so getting into more of the storyline. So I wonder about the nomenclature here. Is internment camp, concentration camp? What do historians mostly use? What do you use throughout the book, and why?
Yeah. It was for me when I first started working on the book. I think, that, like you said, like the nomenclature and the way that we talk about it today is we use the term Japanese internment camp. And right off the bat, I think it's the second or third sentence of this. I give a note on terminology before I start the book. And I say that both parts of that are incorrect. And that most people that went to these camps were not Japanese, they're Japanese American. They were American citizens. 2/3 of all the people that were in camp were Americans. And the other third were people who had been barred from citizenship just
Correct.
because they were Japanese immigrants who couldn't become citizens until the 50s.
Which I don't think a lot of people would have known. I mean, I think there are a lot of
Right.
people who
Yeah.
didn't know that.
Yeah. And that was the thing where it's like, even the people who, if you say like, oh, well, they had to get rid of, had to put these Japanese in camp too. It's like, well, most of them would have been American citizens if you had allowed them to
Right.
become American citizens. And then the term internment actually has like a very specific legal definition in terms of its use for enemy aliens, which
Okay.
is internment is, obviously maybe we could debate the ethics of it, but technically there's a legality that is when it comes to enemy aliens that you can intern enemy aliens based on various war conventions. But that's not what we did. We did do that, but this was something completely different. This wasn't a legal act that was recognized worldwide. It was taking American citizens and making them non-American citizens essentially and putting them in camp, despite the fact that there was no proof or evidence that they would ever turn against the United States. No one in history following World War II was convicted. No Japanese American was convicted of sabotage or espionage against the United States government. So, even in the time, nobody used the term internment camps. They used the term concentration camps. FDR called them concentration camps. So after the war, when concentration camps became synonymous with extermination camps across Europe, that's when the term internment camp started to become
Okay.
more popular to use in the United States to sort of differentiate between what had happened to Japanese and Japanese Americans in the United States and what had happened, to millions of different groups across Europe. So I think now I do use the term concentration camp, but I tended to use incarceration more often, which is sort of an imperfect solution, which I think I say, and that it does imply some sort of wrongdoing. But that's the Japanese American community uses incarceration a lot, in addition to concentration camp. So I wanted to be, I want again, like I said, I want to sort of honor what this community thought the terminology should be, as opposed to just me who's coming into this community with no background
Mm-hmm.
in it. So that was why I used the terminology I did in the book, and that's why it says incarceration on the front of the book instead of
Sure.
internment.
Sure. Tell us a little bit. I mean, main part of the book, but tell us a bit about the importance of sports and specifically football in the camp at Hard Mountain.
Yeah. So when Heart Mountain opened, Heart Mountain Camp opened in August of 1942. And within a few weeks after its opening, it quickly became the third largest city in the state of Wyoming, which is sort of an incredible thing to think about. So, it had 11,000, 12,000 people in it at its peak, and it had all the things that you would have in a 12,000 person community in the 40s. So it had newspaper, school, hospital, um, barbershops, but they had the Japanese American community had to fight for all of these things in that upcoming fall. And one of the first things that they did was they cleared all of this brush and built a baseball field. So that first fall, they had a baseball field, and then they built some sumo wrestling pits, and then they built a football field. So pretty quickly, they said, okay, we're stuck in this camp 1,000 miles away from our homes in California. It's really cold. Most of us have never seen snow before. We're in these terrible barracks in these terrible conditions. What is the one thing right now that we can do that makes us feel more like our community? And that thing was sports. The WRA, which is the War Relocation Authority, which is the group that sent everybody to camp, at the time had barred Japanese language literature and Japanese language music, poetry, things like that. So the Japanese community and Japanese Americans had been stripped of a lot of their cultural identity, because of these rules in the camps. So sports was one thing that they could do that still felt to them as a part of their community that seemed to be given, the quote okay from the authorities and from the army that was and the military police there at the camp.
Mm-hmm.
So the first high school football season isn't until the fall of 1943, and that was really just everything sort of took off from there. And the camp had tons and tons of different football leagues. They had football leagues for men, teenagers, kids. They had elementary school leagues. They had leagues, geographic leagues. They had all-star teams. They had all-star games. And if football pretty quickly just enveloped the entire camp. So the first high school football game is against a team from Warland, which is another community outside of Wyoming. So they drive into camp, and all of a sudden they're greeted by 5,000 fans lining the field, which is bigger than their entire town. If they had taken every person in that entire town, it wouldn't have been able to line that field. Mm-hmm. So these fans were looking for something to do. They had very little to do. They couldn't go anywhere. They had no entertainment. So almost half the camp shows up for that first game, and they're 10 people deep watching this high school football team comprised completely of Japanese American prisoners play this white high school. And it probably, even if you haven't read the book, it's probably not hard to surmise that this team was really, really good. Mm-hmm. And that's why I wanted to write this book about them. And I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that they had just an insane home field advantage, despite the fact that they were behind barbed wire. They were 1,000 miles away from home. Every game they played in the camp to thousands and thousands of fans lining the field. And it gave them probably one of the more unique home field advantages in football history, really.
Sure. Yeah, you talk about Friday Night Lights.
Yeah, I know.
Right. there's so much great football action. I think in just a couple minutes you're going to read a little bit from it. The football action, like we talked about, is incredible. The details are just, it's so fun to read. You know, if fun is the word, because you do get to keep away from the history a little bit, which is obviously
Yeah.
so dark and ugly. It sounds kind of trite by now, I think, but it's there. I mean, as you read over the book, as you wrote the book, as you researched for the book, what kind of echoes of today did you see in what happened in those times?
Oh man, yeah, that was the thing. So, I started working on the book in earnest in the spring of 2017. So it was right after Donald Trump was inaugurated. And whenever I would be working on the book or writing about it or tell people sort of the idea of what I was working on,
Mhm.
even before I had gotten a book deal, they would say like, "Oh, that's so relevant today," and I would say like, "Yeah, you're right." But what they had mentioned, what they compared the relevance to, would change every 6 months. So
Right,
like
right.
at first it would be like about like the family separation policy on the
Mm,
border, and then it would be about the Muslim ban,
right.
and then it would be about kids in cages, and then it would be about X, and then it would be about Y, and then like my book came out the day before the insurrection on the
Oh, that's
Capitol.
right. January 5th. Yeah.
Yeah, so then I started thinking about this book as the way that part of the reason, and one of the main reasons, that 120,000 people of Japanese descent end up in these camps is this disinformation campaign that's put on by newspapers, radio hosts, politicians across the West Coast that blames the Japanese community there for a wide variety of ills that they are never guilty of in any way.
Yeah.
And when I thought about, sort of the last thing that this book compared to in the years that I was writing it and promoting it, that was like the final thing. I was like, okay, this is exactly why all these people stormed the Capitol, was the same sort of disinformation coming from their radios and from the things that they're reading and from politicians, it's the same exact sort of thing that sent all these folks to camp.
Mm.
um so yeah, so like you said, like it really does have a lot of echoes with today. And even when you think about the Uyghur camps in China now, there's all these things that are happening in our day-to-day lives that are really relevant. When I was writing the book, it just it was sad that what it was
Right.
compared to got changed every 6 months or eight
Yeah.
months or a year.
That is very interesting. Yeah, I had not thought about that connection to the insurrection, but it makes a lot of
Yeah,
sense. There's that kind of vacuum of information, right? Or that echo chamber, I guess you would call it. On page 98, this is talking about DeWitt and Benditson. Did I say the last name right?
yeah, yeah,
Who were writing about, some like writing about Japanese as a whole and pushing towards the relocation. And there's something to the effect of, it's an enemy race. The strain has been undiluted, right? Meaning that if, once
yeah,
they're Japanese, doesn't matter if they're American or whatever. And maybe in the same part or later talking, so claiming that the fact that no sabotage has taken place is in
right. I
fact
see where you're going.
evidence that sabotage
Right.
will take place. And
Yeah,
that just, I don't even know how to say it exactly, but it reminds me so much of a lot of like the Trumpism type thing, right?
it's the
Like,
election fraud, right?
right,
Yeah.
right.
It's the
Yes.
exact same thing. It's the exact same thing. And
Hmm.
that's another point that is another point of comparison,
Hmm.
where the War Department basically said, oh, the reason that we can't find any espionage or sabotage is because they're really, really good at espionage and sabotage. And it's the same thing
The
that
cycle, right?
people, it's the same thing that folks, they sort of switch out the proper nouns, and you could
Mm.
apply the same reasoning to the election fraud, where people say like, oh, we need to really dig in and figure out what's happening here with election fraud, because we can't find anything right now on the surface, which means that it's throughout, it's everywhere, like it's all around us, we just can't see it. And you're
People
just
are
like,
saying, people are saying, right? That generic.
yeah, and you're just like, come on, guys.
Yeah.
Like, just sometimes the answer is that it's not there.
Right.
Like, you just have to like
Right.
accept. And that was the thing, like, that no one was willing to accept the intelligence reports at the time in 1941 or 1942. Everyone was so blinded by their racism and their xenophobia and hatred of this one group that they were refused to admit that maybe they were loyal Americans.
Hmm. Yeah. I mean, we could talk for hours about all those connections there. I wanted to end with a little bit of, I guess, craft or style. you talk about setting context and all of that. I really appreciated how your chapters are very distinct in some ways, at least the beginnings, right?
Mhm.
It's almost like I mean, you might come out of nowhere, like in Kent, Washington. It's like, wait, what? Where's it going? And then it totally comes together and it really builds upon the previous chapter. So I thought that was really well done.
Yeah, I really appreciate that. And that's the kind of thing where I think that's the like magazine writer in me, where I have to
Mm-hmm.
like, I feel like I would try to leave the reader with something at the end of every chapter that would like
Yes.
pull them through the beginning. And I knew that if I started the next chapter on like a boring note, they
Hmm.
would put the book down for the night and go to bed. But I thought that if I gave the reader a story at the beginning of every chapter
Right.
and gave them an event or a character or something, and like there's one that I'm thinking of in particular, and the Kent Washington one's a good example, but also the one where I talk about the prison break at Alcatraz, where it's
Mm-hmm.
just like it's sort of this tangential event, but it also sort of like sets the tone for what was going on in San Francisco the day
Yes.
of this hearing that DeWitt is basically defending his racism. So it's sort
Mm-hmm.
of, for me, and a lot of that is some of those stories that I end up using in that way were because I was reading that DeWitt story and that Alcatraz story specifically, as I was going through some newspaper archive about the DeWitt story and I was reading about that hearing. And then I was like, oh, this is on page, whatever, 8 of the San Francisco Chronicle. Let me see what the big, like, main news of the day was. And I flip over and page 1 is, biggest prison break in Alcatraz history. And I was like, oh, okay, well, this is super interesting. Like, this is what everyone was talking about in San Francisco that
Mm-hmm.
day as DeWitt was about to prepare for this hearing. So that was, I'm glad that you liked that, because that was something that I really wanted to do, to sort of, I thought about the chapters almost in a way that, like, when you write a magazine feature, you think about your section breaks and you think about
Okay.
how to keep a reader going on in the next section break.
Sure.
So that was, especially like you said, like later on in the book too, where I sort of break the chapters down, especially in that first season, by the games and by those communities, that those felt like I could write those like individual stories. I could write those as
Mm-hmm.
individual sort of profiles of this community that this team was coming from. And then the individual story of that, just that game. And even if that chapter is only 2,000 words or 6 or 8 pages long, you sort of felt like you had this contained story there
Mm-hmm.
um, that made sense for me from a chapter standpoint.
Yeah, definitely very, very successful for sure. I mean, there are those little breaks, but for the most part, the story is linear.
Mhm.
It's not like it's going crazy back and forth, but the flashback scenes you have, a few flashback scenes that are so interesting and so engaging emotionally because you kind of have that juxtaposition of the way things were, the innocence, the carefree when Bay was back in LA,
Yeah.
and then the negativity of that. So that was really well done as well.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
It was, well, I wanted to like, there was just so much where it was like, when I was writing the book, there was this one picture that I had like in my head the whole time. There was a picture also at the museum where you saw these teenage boys at the camp and they had their Letterman jackets on and
Hmm.
their sort of pegged Levi's and boots and like, gel back pompadoured hair.
So they were styling.
And
They were styling.
yeah, but it
Yeah.
was also, for me, it was like you put a thumb over that face, and that's any teenage boy from LA or San
Hmm.
Francisco at that time.
Hmm.
So it always resonated with me that I wanted to tell this American story about these kids who just happen to have Japanese parents and were forced into this camp because of that. That they were teenagers that got wrapped up in this proxy battle
Hmm.
of racism. But again, they were just kids that wanted to hang out with their friends and cruise Cahuenga Boulevard in a car on a
Right.
Friday night
Hmm.
and go, get hamburgers and try to kiss girls.
Hmm.
So it's like, for me, that was why I tried to use some of those little flashbacks to sort of
Hmm.
remind the reader that, like, this is the life that they had in LA or Seattle or wherever it was.
Yeah, and also very universal, this idea of being American and what that means. Some of the Japanese Americans, they didn't speak a lick of Japanese. Some of them, Hawaii was foreign to them. Their families had moved from Japan way back, then to Hawaii, then to California. And I won't ruin it, but the scene where George, some of the scenes where George is in Japan with later on in the army, were like, oh man, I mean, just
Yeah,
crushing, and obviously a lot had to do with the horrible atomic bomb,
yeah,
disaster and all that.
but you're right. Like, and that's the thing where it's like, George barely spoke any Japanese. So
Hmm.
it's like he, and that was always one of the reasons that he was sort of kept at arm's length from the rest of his family too, was his more Americanness, I think. Um, but yeah, and that's like you said, like it varied for every family and it varied for every character in the book how quote Japanese their family really was, or if they originally came from Hawaii, from Japan to Hawaii, like you
Sure.
said, like there was so much there that like in any American group, you sort of had the differences there
Hmm.
in the Japanese community too.
No doubt. We'd appreciate it if maybe you could read a little bit. That'd be
Yeah,
awesome.
I'm actually going to read a section that I think you kind of just mentioned there about a kind of like a flashback. So it's
Okay.
sort of like a fake.
Cool.
It's like a fake flashback.
Okay.
So this scene takes place. This is the second game the Eagles ever played, and it was against a team from Carbon County, Montana, which is a mining community right across the Wyoming Montana border. So this part of Wyoming is pretty isolated from the rest of the state, especially at that time. So they played a lot of high schools that were in Wyoming and Montana too. So this is against the Carbon County Red Lodge, Montana Coyotes. The 1,100 person student body filled the sidelines once again. If the Worland game was expected to be a blowout in favor of the visitors, the fans, coaches, and players had no idea what to expect from the team from Red Lodge. The county's location on the state line meant the Coyotes split their games, half Montana teams, half Wyoming teams. No one at Heart Mountain knew anything about the Smith Mine disaster or the fact that most of the Coyotes were off in the South Pacific aboard a Navy ship. All they knew was that the team had lost to Cody the previous week, which didn't stop the Sentinel sports editor from confidently announcing, quote, with Babe Nomura leading the attack from his tailback position, the Heart Mountain 11 is favored to take the Red Lodge Prepsters by a 3-touchdown margin. The teams lined up under a 78-degree sky, and the Carbon County kicker sent the ball deep. Kichi took the ball at the 10-yard line and ran diagonally across the field, heading to the left sideline. Babe faked as a blocker, then sprinted toward Kichi. The pitch was flawless. Babe cradled the ball, looked downfield, and saw nothing but open dirt. Arms pumping as the dust kicked up beneath him, he was gone. Gone from that field, gone from camp, gone from Wyoming. Remove the barracks and the barbed wire and the military police. Add some bleachers and sketch in the Hollywood Roosevelt Hotel looming over the field. Replace the stones with grass, color in the green of the palm trees and the white of the wobbly Hollywood sign watching for Mount Lee. Replace all the bad with all the good, and for those seconds, he can be just a boy doing what he loves most. Babe strode into the end zone, untouched. Out of either pity or kindness, Tubby and Thompson pulled the first team. In went Tazo and Stan and the others, second and third stringers, determined to fight their way into the starting lineup. Their baptism was beset by penalties, holding, clipping, offsides, spending too much time in the huddle. The first two were the result of carelessness, but the latter two were more understandable. 11 teens who'd never played the sport before on a stage in front of 4,000 of their peers and neighbors. The anxiety and indecisiveness could be forgiven. Despite their nerves, in the second quarter, backup quarterback Billy Shundo marched the Eagles down the field. The drive ended on a 20-yard strike to a wide open Masu Cheetah in the end zone. The first stringers returned for the second half and kicked off to the Coyotes. It didn't take long for the ball to be back in Babe's hands. Standing on the Coyote 47, he called a play for himself. Horse cleared the way at left tackle. Babe cut back to the middle and went untouched again through the back of the end zone. Up 19-0, Tubby decided to try another one of his new plays as the Eagles' next offensive possession. At 5 feet 11 inches, Horse was the tallest player on the Eagles. On a team mainly of teenage boys between 5 feet 5 inches and 5 feet 8 inches, this should have meant that he'd either play quarterback or another position where his height could be used in passing or catching situations. But Horse lacked one thing: any real ability with his hands. He couldn't throw or even catch. He couldn't shoot a basketball particularly well, nor hurl a baseball. The only thing he could do well with his hands was throw a punch. On the football field, he could block, and that was about it. Still, Tubby saw a chance to use Horse's size. On their next offensive possession, Yoichi snapped the ball to Babe, who faked a run up the middle. Babe wheeled around, pitching the ball to Horse, who'd peeled off from left tackle and was breaking downfield with a head of steam. As the Coyotes collapsed on him, he lateraled Tomas Ogamachi, drifting wide right. The 20-yard gain was nullified by penalty, but the message was clear. We're going to play our style of football. In the waning minutes of the third quarter, the Coyotes punted from deep in their own territory. Kichi ran it back 38 yards for the fourth and final touchdown. The Eagle starters took the field for only 6 plays the entire afternoon. They walked off with a 25-0 win. After the game, Babe was interviewed by the high school newspaper. When asked about his prowess not only on the football field, but the basketball court and the baseball diamond, he would only say that he knew, quote, a little bit about ping pong.
That's a great line by Babe there.
I know, right?
I could see, like, the descendants of them reading that over and just like reading it again and again and again, that description. Like, man, Grandpa could run, man. Oh, Grandpa didn't have he
Yeah.
had terrible hands, huh? Just like,
Yeah.
yeah. So I mean, so the book has that. The book has great sports action. The book has great nostalgia, if you will, and the book, of course, has some really important historical context and background and great research. So thank you so much for reading that. That was
Of
great,
course.
great,
Yeah.
great to hear
Thanks.
that excerpt. And the last question I got for you is, what's next? What are you working on?
Oh, it's a great question. Like I said earlier, I sort of have picked through other people's books, and there's one thing that I found in my research that luckily I was able to use some of the research I wasn't able to use for the book in a couple of New York Times stories. But there's one other thing that only tangentially relates to the Japanese American community that I'm kind of starting to look at for another book, but
Okay.
just at the very beginning stages. And, unfortunately for my wife, it's would be based on the West Coast again. So I would be flying back. When we first started writing the book, we were in Dallas, and now we're in Philly. So Dallas to LA wasn't as much of a time commitment as the
Mm-hmm.
Philly to LA flights are. So we'll see. And then working on a couple features right now for a couple different publications.
Nice.
And, hopefully those will be out hopefully later in the year. And then I'm actually getting my magazine editing juices going again with some editing packages and things for publication too. So a little bit of everything, and just starting to see where, writing a book is pretty isolating in a way that I went from being in newsrooms to all of a sudden just being by myself and being responsible for everything that comes with the book. So I wouldn't mind working with other people again for a little bit.
Sure.
At least just, but I guess right now it's like nobody's really working with their colleagues.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much different it would be, but we'll see.
Thanks so much. I enjoyed the heck out of the conversation. I'm a huge fan of the book. I'm going to be, promoting it on my social media, promoting it, word of mouth. Thanks again for writing it, and thanks again for giving of your time. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for so much for having me. I love doing this, especially great interviews like this one.
I appreciate that. What a pleasure it's been to speak to Brad Pearson. And thank you for listening to episode 47. You can now subscribe to the podcast on Apple Podcasts, and please leave me a 5-star review. You can also ask for the podcast by name using Alexa, and find the pod on Stitcher, that's new, Spotify, and on Amazon Music. Follow me on Instagram, where I'm at Chills at Will Podcast, or on Twitter, where I'm at Chills at Will PO1. This is a passion project of mine, a DIY operation, and I'd love for your help in promoting what I'm convinced is a unique and spirited look in an often ignored art form. The intro song for the Chills at Will podcast is Wind Down instrumental version, and the other song played on this episode was Hoops instrumental by Matt Whitehour, and both great songs are used through archesaudio.com. For now, thanks again for listening, and I hope that these quarantine days bring you texts by writers with mad skills, like Brad Pearson, whose work gives you chills at will.